She didn't fall from grace. She was pushed, and the men who pushed her were still sitting in her boardroom, collecting their salaries, waiting for her to disappear. Elena Whitmore built Whitmore Group from nothing into a billion-dollar empire before she turned 30. Then one night, her car went off a rain-slicked bridge outside Chicago, and the woman who survived wasn't the same one who drove onto it. 2 years later, she runs her company from a wheelchair, barely speaks, and trusts no one. Nathan Brooks is just a brand strategist hired to fix her image. He has no plan to save her. He isn't even sure he can save himself. If this story already has you hooked, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The assignment came on a Tuesday, which Nathan Brooks would later think of as either very good timing or very bad, depending on what day you asked him. He was standing in the break room at Colton and Reed Brand Strategy, pouring his second coffee of the morning, even though it was barely 8:15 and he hadn't slept well, and the coffee here was never actually good. It was just hot and present, which was about all he asked of most things lately. His colleague, Derek, appeared in the doorway wearing the particular expression he wore when he was about to deliver news that was technically interesting but probably inconvenient. "Whitmore Group," Derek said. Nathan turned around. "What about them?" "They hired us. Full brand rehabilitation package. Your lead." Nathan set his mug down. The name landed differently than most clients did. Whitmore Group wasn't just a company. It was the kind of company that showed up in business school case studies. The scrappy startup that became a logistics and supply chain giant in under a decade, built almost entirely by one person. Elena Whitmore. He'd read the profile in a magazine somewhere, the one from 4 or 5 years back before the accident. The cover photo showed a woman in a sharp blazer, arms crossed, looking at the camera like she'd already decided she was going to win whatever conversation you were about to have. "Okay," he said. "You know what happened to her?" "Car accident 2 years ago. She's been in a wheelchair since. The company's been bleeding PR problems. She fired 3 communications directors in 6 months, pulled out of 2 major partnerships without explanation, and hasn't done a public appearance in over a year. Investors are nervous. The board requested external help." Derek paused. "She didn't request it. She's not happy about it." "Great," Nathan said. "When do I meet her?" "Thursday. Her office. She has final say on everything, and apparently she's already killed 2 proposals from other firms this month, so..." Derek shrugged, which was his version of good luck. Nathan picked his coffee back up. "I'll figure it out." He said that automatically, the way he said a lot of things. It had become a kind of habit over the past few years. Not confidence exactly, more like the refusal to let uncertainty sit in the room too long. He'd learned that from necessity. When Sophie's mother left, when it was suddenly just the 2 of them in a 2-bedroom apartment on the north side, and Sophie was 5 and still asking questions Nathan didn't know how to answer, he couldn't afford to stand there looking unsure. You just moved forward and figured it out as you went. It wasn't a strategy, it was survival with a decent poker face. Oh shit. He picked Sophie up from school that afternoon the same as always, which meant fighting the pickup line traffic for 12 minutes before she spotted his car and ran toward it with her backpack bouncing, and something in her hand she wanted to show him immediately. Today it was a drawing, a house with a yellow sun and 4 figures of varying height standing in front of it. "Who's the tall one?" he asked. "That's you." "Why do I have a triangle head?" "Because you always make that face when you're thinking," she demonstrated, scrunching her nose and pulling her chin in, which he supposed was fair. "And that's me, and that's Mrs. Calloway, and that's Biscuit." Biscuit was their neighbor's dog, to whom Sophie had developed a deep and apparently permanent attachment, despite the fact that Biscuit had chewed through one of Nathan's good leather belts on 3 separate occasions. He'd given up being annoyed about it somewhere around the 2nd time. "It's a good drawing," he said, which was true. She was better at drawing than he'd been at her age, better than he was now. They drove home through the gray October light, Sophie narrating the events of her day with the particular detail and intensity she applied to everything. What Jalen said at lunch, how the substitute for art class didn't know where the good markers were kept, the extremely important matter of whether the school was getting a hamster or a fish for the classroom pet, and why she firmly believed hamsters were superior. Nathan listened and asked questions and let the familiar rhythm of it settle him the way it always did, like something coming back into alignment. He was heating up dinner when he remembered he'd promised to prep materials for Thursday. He stayed up until midnight reading everything he could find about Elena Whitmore and Whitmore Group. The founding story, the growth years, the accident, the aftermath. Financial reports, news coverage, an op-ed from a former board member that walked a careful line between concern and veiled criticism. A brief statement from Elena's office after the accident that said she was recovering and would return to leadership duties shortly. And then, mostly, silence. She'd gone quiet. The company continued operating somehow, but Elena herself had retreated behind layers of executive assistants and closed-door meetings and the occasional terse email that people apparently received and did not respond to lightly. He turned off his laptop at 12:17 and sat in the quiet apartment for a minute. The building had that specific late-night stillness where you could hear the refrigerator hum and someone's television 2 units over and nothing else. He thought about what Derek had said. She didn't request it, and wondered what it felt like to have your own board go around you to hire people to fix the problem that you'd become. He thought that probably felt awful and that it was worth remembering. Thus, the Whitmore Group offices occupied the top 4 floors of a building in the West Loop, and they were exactly what Nathan expected from a company with that kind of trajectory: clean, expensive, designed to feel permanent. The receptionist at the 41st floor was professional in the way that expensive things often were, efficient and pleasant with a quality of revealing nothing. He'd arrived 10 minutes early. He waited 23 minutes past the scheduled time before Elena's executive assistant, a composed woman named Claire, appeared and walked him down a hallway that Nathan noticed was notably clear of other people, like someone had arranged it that way. The corner office was large and precisely arranged, floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, a desk that was almost aggressively uncluttered, and behind it, Elena Whitmore. She wasn't what he'd expected, which he realized immediately was a failure of imagination on his part. He'd been carrying the magazine cover in his head, the power blazer, the deliberate posture, the look of someone who'd already decided things. The woman across from him was 30 years old and looked like she'd been somewhere very hard and hadn't entirely come back yet. She was sitting in a manual wheelchair positioned at a slight angle to the desk, and she was watching him walk toward her with an expression that had precisely nothing welcoming in it. "Mr. Brooks," she said, not as a greeting, more as an acknowledgement that he existed and was now in her office. "Ms. Whitmore." He sat down across from her without being invited to, because he had a feeling that waiting to be invited was going to establish exactly the wrong dynamic. "Thank you for the time." "You have 45 minutes, she said. "The deck you sent was technically competent. But," she looked at him, "but it's the same framework I've seen from 4 other firms in the past year. Reintroduce the leader, humanize the brand, controlled media appearances, build a comeback narrative." She said it flatly, like she was reading from a document she'd already decided to throw away. "I'm not interested in a comeback narrative." "What are you interested in?" "Fixing the actual problems with our market positioning and partner communications, not managing optics." "Those things aren't separate," Nathan said. Something shifted in her face, almost too quick to catch. "Excuse me?" He'd surprised himself a little, but he kept going because backing off now felt like exactly the wrong move. If your partners are pulling back and your investors are nervous, part of that is perception. Not all of it, but part of it. The question is what the perception is attached to. Which you're going to tell me. "I spent a week reading everything I could find about your company and about you. The company's fundamentals are solid, the operational side, the numbers, the actual business. What's broken is the face of it. And the face of this company has always been you." He paused. "So whatever happened that made you go quiet, that's what's causing the problem. Not the products, not the services. The absence." The room was very still. Elena looked at him for a long moment, and he couldn't tell what she was thinking, which he'd been told happened to people in meetings with her fairly often. Then she said, "You're being paid to fix the brand. I can't fix the brand without understanding why it broke, and you're the only person who can explain that." "I didn't break anything." "No," he said. "Something broke around you. That's different." He meant it honestly, not as a therapeutic observation, more as a practical one. He watched her face and saw something move through it that he couldn't quite name. Not softness, not that, but something that was responding to being talked to like a person instead of a problem. She didn't answer immediately. She wheeled back slightly from the desk, almost unconsciously, and looked toward the window. Outside, Chicago extended in every direction under a flat November sky. After a moment, she said, "The accident changed how people look at me." "How do they look at you?" "Like I'm less," still toward the window. "Like I'm something that needs to be managed. Like the person who built this company couldn't possibly still be in here doing it." He didn't say anything right away because he thought whatever came next mattered, and he didn't want to get it wrong. After a second, he said, "Is that why you stopped doing public appearances?" She turned back to him. The look on her face was complicated. He'd interrupted something she hadn't meant to say that much of. "We're getting off track." "Okay," he said. "I want a strategy that addresses our Q2 partnership losses and the communication breakdown with the Hargrove distribution network. I want deliverables, not press tours." "Understood." He pulled out his notebook. "Let's start there." They worked for the next 40 minutes in a way that was businesslike and clipped, and occasionally tense when Nathan asked questions she considered none of his business, which was often, and occasionally almost comfortable when they landed on specifics where her thinking was clear and decisive and frankly impressive. She knew her company with the kind of granular precision that came from having built it yourself. Not managed it, built it, made the calls that nobody wanted to make, held things together through the years when it could have fallen apart 6 different ways. That part was still completely intact, whatever else had changed. When Claire knocked and appeared in the doorway to signal the end of the time, Elena said, without looking up from the document they'd been reviewing, "Next meeting is Monday. Come with a revised framework. Less narrative, more operational." "I'll have something," Nathan said, standing. He gathered his things, and then, because the thought was there and he didn't see a reason not to say it, he said, "For what it's worth. The person in that magazine profile, she's still in the room. That's clear." Elena looked up. Her expression was careful and closed, the way a door looks when someone has locked it but hasn't left yet. She didn't say anything. He nodded and left. The revised framework took him 4 days and required him to stay up past midnight twice, which Sophie registered with the particular awareness that 7-year-olds have for disruptions to routine, the kind of awareness that probably serves some evolutionary purpose and currently manifested as her appearing in the hallway at 11:45 p.m. in her pajamas with a serious expression. "You're doing work," she said. "I am. Go back to bed." "Who is it for?" "A client. Company called Whitmore Group." "Is she nice?" He almost said she's complicated, then remembered he was talking to a 7-year-old who asked follow-up questions. "She's dealing with some hard things. He thought about it. "She's figuring stuff out." Sophie considered this with the gravity she brought to information she intended to file away. "Okay," she said. "Don't stay up too late." She padded back down the hallway, which Nathan thought was probably the most parental thing that had been said in the apartment all week. Monday's meeting was shorter and more productive, the shape of the professional relationship establishing itself. Elena responded to concrete things, specifics, numbers, problems with identifiable causes and potential solutions. She had no patience for vagueness or for the kind of strategic language that padded out the actual content of ideas, which Nathan appreciated because he had no patience for it either. She also, he noticed, had no one. That wasn't exactly fair. She had Claire, who was clearly competent and clearly protective, and there were other people in and around the office, an inner circle of some kind. But there was a specific quality to the way people interacted with Elena that Nathan recognized from watching it happen in front of him over several meetings. They were careful. Everyone around her had calibrated themselves to a particular distance, professional and attentive but never fully present, like they'd learned that getting too close meant risking something they didn't want to risk. He understood why. She was prickly and remote, and she pushed back on everything. It was easier to stay peripheral. He kept showing up anyway, not because it was strategic, although it wasn't bad strategy, but because he'd sat across from her enough times now to see the shape of the thing she was dealing with, and it was genuinely not what anyone around her seemed to think it was. The problem wasn't that Elena Whitmore had lost her ability to lead. The problem was that she was doing it from inside a wall she'd built after the accident, and the wall was doing its job so well that even she seemed to have forgotten it was there on purpose. He learned this in pieces, the way you learn most things about people, sideways, through what they said when they weren't trying to say anything significant, a comment about a board meeting she'd missed. The way she talked about the accident in the past tense, but with a tension in her jaw that meant it was still very present. The fact that she hadn't left the building for lunch, and Claire mentioned this once, quietly, not as a complaint but as a fact, 7 months. He didn't push on any of it directly. He just kept coming back, kept treating her like someone who was still running the room, because she was, because that was accurate. Kept asking the questions that were actually about the business, and occasionally also about her, because the business and her were not actually separable. It was in the 3rd week that he said, almost offhandedly, "The Hargrove situation is going to require you to be in the room with them. An in-person meeting, not a video call." She went still. "That can be arranged. With you, not a delegate." "I'm aware of what you mean. When did you last meet with partners face-to-face?" A silence that lasted about 2 seconds too long. "That's not relevant." "Elena." It was the first time he'd used her name without the title, and they both noticed it. "It's very relevant." She looked at him with something that was close to anger, except it had something else underneath it that wasn't anger. "The way I work has adapted to my situation." "I know it has. I'm not saying it hasn't. I'm saying that some situations require the thing that's hardest, and this is one of them." He paused. "You went off a bridge 2 years ago, and you got back up. The Hargrove meeting is considerably less." He hadn't planned to say that. He wasn't sure if it was the right thing to say. It landed in the room and sat there. Elena looked at him for a long time. Her expression went through several things he couldn't track and came out the other side into something quieter and harder to read. When she spoke, her voice was even. "You're a brand strategist." "I am. Not a therapist. Not even close." Something that was almost a smile moved across her face. Almost, the first thing resembling one he'd seen. It was gone quickly, but it had been there. "The Hargrove meeting," she said. "I'll consider it." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't what she'd been saying before, which was nothing at all. He drove home that night in the particular Chicago November darkness, streetlights blurring in light rain on the windshield, and thought that something had shifted somewhere in the day's work, and that he wasn't entirely sure what it meant yet, but that it mattered. He just didn't know how much. The Hargrove meeting happened on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Nathan had said what he'd said, and Elena had said she'd consider it. It almost didn't happen at all. He found out later from Claire that Elena had canceled it twice internally, once at midnight the night before and once again at 6 a.m. the day of, reinstating it both times within the hour without explanation. Claire relayed this information with the carefully neutral expression of someone who had learned not to editorialize about her employer's decisions, but the fact that she mentioned it at all told Nathan something. Claire didn't volunteer things. She was telling him because she thought he should know. The meeting was at a hotel conference room in the River North neighborhood, which Elena had insisted on rather than the Whitmore offices, and Nathan had understood immediately why. Neutral ground was psychologically easier. You were not being observed by your own walls. He got there early and watched the room fill with the Hargrove team, 6 people, their VP of operations leading, a man named Gerald Pratt, who had the particular energy of someone who had decided in advance how the meeting was going to go. They arranged themselves on one side of the table and ordered coffee and talked among themselves in that slightly too loud way that was really about making sure the other party heard them being comfortable. Elena came in at exactly the scheduled time, which meant she'd been waiting somewhere nearby rather than risk being late and having to manage the entrance under observation. Nathan saw it and said nothing. She wheeled to the head of the table, Claire behind her, and the Hargrove team went through a brief recalibration that they tried to make invisible and mostly failed at. "Mr. Pratt," Elena said, "thank you for making the trip." "Of course, Miss Whitmore." Pratt's eyes did the thing that people's eyes did sometimes, a quick downward flick to the wheelchair, then back up, the whole thing taking maybe half a second and carrying exactly the weight she'd described to Nathan. "Like I'm less. We've been looking forward to getting back to the table." What followed was 2 hours of negotiation that was technically about the renegotiation of a distribution agreement and was actually about whether Hargrove believed Whitmore Group was still a company worth betting on. Pratt tested her on 3 separate occasions with the kind of questions that weren't really questions. They were assessments of competence disguised as requests for clarification. Each time, Elena answered with the specificity and command that Nathan had been watching for weeks. And each time he saw Pratt recalibrate slightly, the pre-decided outcome of the meeting shifting. She didn't perform. That was the thing. She didn't put on the blazer and cover photo version of herself or try to prove something. She just knew the business cold and said what she thought and didn't soften anything that didn't need softening. Pratt came in expecting to find a diminished version of what Whitmore Group had been and found instead the person who'd built it, sitting across the table, waiting for him to stop testing her so they could get to work. They left with a renewed 18-month agreement and a framework for 2 new logistics corridors that hadn't existed when they walked in. In the hallway afterward, while Claire handled the paperwork, Elena sat in the quiet of the emptying corridor and didn't say anything for a moment. Nathan stood nearby, not pressing. "That was harder than it should have been," she said finally. "Yeah," he said. "It was." She looked up at him. "Most people would have said it was fine." "It wasn't fine. It was hard. And you did it anyway." She looked away down the corridor. "Don't make it into something." "I'm not. I'm just not pretending it was easy when it wasn't." He picked up his bag. "Same time next week?" She almost smiled again. That same brief almost thing from the office, there and gone. "Monday," she said. "There are 3 more partnerships on the list." The rhythm of it built across November. Nathan came to the Whitmore offices twice a week, sometimes 3 times, working through the strategic framework that had expanded well beyond what the initial scope had described. The partnership recovery plan, the internal communications overhaul, a quiet but significant restructuring of how Elena's calendar was managed so that she was present and visible within the company in ways that didn't require press releases or public announcements, just the CEO moving through her own organization, which turned out to be more important than anyone had said out loud. He noticed things. He was good at noticing things. It was most of why he was decent at his job. He noticed that the people who worked for Elena were not afraid of her in the way that bad bosses made their people afraid, but in the way that people are afraid of disappointing someone they respect. There was a difference. The fear in this building was the kind that came from caring, which meant the foundation of the place was better than its current PR suggested. He also noticed that she was alone in a way that had nothing to do with being physically solitary. She had meetings all day. She had Claire and her executive team and a calendar packed with decisions. But there was nobody who talked to her like she was just a person. Everybody had their role, their professional relationship, their careful distance. He wasn't sure she even noticed it anymore. He suspected she'd decided, at some point after the accident, that this was simply what her life was, efficient and populated and fundamentally empty of anything that wasn't work. He didn't plan what happened next. It was a consequence of logistics. The first Friday in December, he had to bring Sophie with him to a late afternoon meeting because her school had a half day, and his usual backup, his neighbor, Mrs. Adebayo, was at a doctor's appointment. He warned Claire in advance, apologized for it, and brought a book and headphones for Sophie, and set her up in the small waiting area outside Elena's office with strict instructions to stay put and be quiet. Sophie lasted about 25 minutes before she got bored and wandered. Nathan didn't know this had happened until he came out of the conference room from a side discussion with Elena's operations director and heard a voice, Sophie's voice, with that particular confident pitch she used when she decided someone was worth talking to, coming from the direction of Elena's office. He moved quickly down the hallway and arrived in Elena's doorway to find his daughter sitting in a chair she had pulled up to within 3 feet of Elena's desk, turned sideways so her legs dangled over the armrest, which was a sitting position Nathan had banned multiple times and which Sophie consistently regarded as optional, holding up her drawing book. "And this is supposed to be a dog, but it looks more like a bread," Sophie was saying, "which is embarrassing, but my dad says the important thing is that I know what it is." Elena was looking at the drawing with an expression that Nathan had never seen on her before. It wasn't soft, exactly. It was more like someone who had walked into a room and found something they hadn't expected to find there and hadn't decided what to do with it yet. "Sophie," Nathan said from the doorway, in the specific tone that meant we have discussed this. Sophie looked up. I was being quiet, and then I got done being quiet. You were supposed to stay in the waiting area. I did stay there, and then I finished staying there. She turned back to Elena with the conversational fluency of a child who understood that adults were mostly easily redirected. Do you want to see the one of the house? It has my dad in it. He has a triangle head. Elena glanced up at Nathan, and something passed across her face that was, he was almost certain, something close to amusement. She controlled it immediately. I can see it, she said to Sophie, which was either the result of being caught off guard or a deliberate choice, and Nathan wasn't sure which. Sophie flipped to the house drawing. That's him, and that's me, and that's Biscuit. He's a dog, but you can tell because he's not shaped like bread. He does look more like a dog, Elena agreed. Do you have a dog? No? Do you want one? Elena paused. I haven't thought about it. You should think about it, Sophie said with great seriousness. Biscuit doesn't even live with us, and he makes everything better. That's how good dogs are. Nathan crossed the room and put a hand on Sophie's shoulder. We're going to go. I'm sorry about this. She's fine, Elena said. He stopped. Elena was looking at Sophie's drawing still, with that unreadable expression. She's fine, she said again, quieter, and it didn't sound like a polite dismissal. It sounded like something she meant. Sophie, who recognized an invitation when she heard one, stayed for another 14 minutes. Nathan stood in the corner of the office, feeling uncertain in a way he couldn't quite account for, watching his daughter show Elena drawings and talk about the hamster versus fish debate with full prosecutorial commitment and ask Elena what her job was, and listening to Elena explain it in terms that were patient and accurate and not condescending in the way that adults often talk to children about work. Sophie listened with her serious face, the one she got when she was filing things away. So, you're in charge of the whole thing, Sophie concluded. Yes. Is it hard? A pause that was half a second longer than it needed to be. Sometimes. My dad says hard things are worth it, Sophie said. He says that, but I also notice he makes a face when he says it, like maybe he's not totally sure. She looked at Nathan. It's okay, Dad. I believe you, mostly. Nathan laughed despite himself. Elena made a sound that was so close to a laugh that he looked at her, and she was looking at Sophie with an expression that had something raw and unguarded in it, just for a moment, the wall down without her seeming to notice. Then she noticed, and it went back up, but slowly, like she wasn't in a hurry to close it this time. Chub. After that, Sophie came with him twice more before December was out, not by accident, because Nathan made a decision, not a conscious one, more an absence of the decision to prevent it. And Sophie's presence changed the texture of being in Elena's office in a way he couldn't quite explain. Not dramatically. Sophie was not a magic solution to anything. She was a 7-year-old who asked too many questions and left her jacket on Elena's waiting area chair twice. But she talked to Elena like Elena was just a person, which nobody else in the building did, and Elena responded to it the way a person does when they've been talked to that way for the first time in a while. Carefully at first, then less carefully, then not carefully at all. The second visit, Sophie asked to see the view from the windows, and Elena wheeled over and showed her, pointing out the river and the bridges and a building with an unusual rooftop structure that Sophie found very interesting. They stood, Sophie stood, Elena sat, at the window for almost 10 minutes while Nathan pretended to check his email. He wasn't really checking his email. The third visit, Sophie asked Elena if she was sad, the way children ask things like that, without architecture or preamble. Elena looked at her. What makes you ask that? You look sad sometimes. Not always. Just sometimes. Sophie's tone was matter-of-fact, not unkind. My dad looked sad for a long time after my mom left. He didn't think I noticed, but I noticed. The office was quiet. Nathan felt his chest do something uncomfortable. I'm not sad, Elena said carefully. Okay, Sophie said, in the tone that meant I heard you, but I have my own information. Elena looked at her for a moment and then said, unexpectedly, I was, for a while, after my accident. But not now. She paused, and Nathan watched her choose words she meant rather than words that would close the conversation. It's more complicated than sad. Sophie nodded. She understood complicated. Nathan had told her some things were complicated on a regular basis. My dad says complicated is okay. He says it means there's more than one thing happening at once. She paused. He's pretty smart, mostly. Elena glanced at Nathan with an expression he couldn't entirely decode. Mostly, she agreed. In the second week of December, Claire stopped Nathan in the hallway with the professional composure of someone delivering a message they've been carrying carefully. She's been leaving the office for lunch, Claire said. Started 2 weeks ago. I thought you should know. He did know, because he'd been the one to suggest the taco place 3 blocks away, offhandedly, when Elena mentioned she hadn't eaten and it was 2 p.m. She'd said she didn't really leave the building for lunch. He'd said the carnitas were worth it. She'd said nothing, and the next day Claire had mentioned Elena had gone out. He hadn't brought it up. Good, he said. It's the first time in 7 months, Claire said. She let that sit for a second. I don't know what you're doing, but whatever it is. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. It was also in December that he started to notice the board. He noticed it first in the way that you notice something without realizing you're noticing it. A name that came up twice in different contexts, a question that was framed oddly, a dynamic in a meeting that didn't quite match the organizational chart. The Whitmore Group Board had 12 members, a mix of early investors and appointed directors, and most of them functioned normally, the way boards did. But there were 3, Richard Castle, the board's vice chair, a director named Dennis Farrow, and a woman named Patricia Holm who chaired the risk committee, who had a quality in meetings that Nathan kept returning to. They were too aligned, not in the way of people who agreed, in the way of people who had decided in advance. He brought it up to Elena obliquely after a board call that had run long and gotten heated over a capital allocation proposal that 3 members had opposed with what seemed like coordinated arguments. The opposition to the Meridian proposal, he said. That was organized. Elena looked at him sharply. It's a board. There are positions. Castle, Farrow, and Holm have voted together on 9 of the last 11 contested motions. I pulled the records. He slid a sheet across the desk. He'd been up until 1 in the morning putting it together. That's not a coincidence. That's coordination. She looked at the sheet for a long time. Board members talk to each other. They do. This is different. He paused. Elena, do you know why they'd want the Meridian acquisition to fail? She was quiet. He watched something work through her face, not surprise exactly, more like a thought that had been somewhere in the peripheral vision finally coming forward. Meridian would consolidate our southeastern distribution network, she said slowly. Remove the dependence on the Castle family's freight subsidiary. Nathan had found that too, buried in a corporate disclosure 2 pages past where anyone would normally look. Richard Castle's family held a 15% stake in a freight company called Landway Solutions that currently had a preferred vendor agreement with Whitmore Group. An acquisition of Meridian would make that agreement irrelevant. He's worth somewhere around $8 million a year through that preferred agreement, Nathan said. Elena was very still. You found this in the public disclosures, with time and a spreadsheet. My legal team hasn't flagged this. Your legal team isn't looking for it. He let that sit. I might be wrong about what it means. You're not. Her voice was measured, but her hands, flat on the desk, were not quite still. What else did you find? He hesitated, because the rest of it was more than a conflict of interest. The rest of it was something he'd spent 3 days trying to find a different explanation for and had failed. There's a pattern in the period just before your accident, he said. Board communications. I found some in the shareholder disclosure documents from that period, things that had to be filed. The 3 of them were pushing hard for a leadership transition vote. They didn't have the votes for it. You were blocking 2 acquisitions they wanted and restructuring the vendor contracts in ways that were cutting into related party revenue. He paused. The accident happened 9 days after Castle formally requested a special session to discuss leadership succession. The silence in the room was different from previous silences. Elena's face had gone into a quality of stillness that Nathan recognized now as what she looked like when something was hitting very hard and she wasn't going to show it. The police investigation said it was road conditions, she said. Rain. The barrier wasn't rated for... She stopped. They investigated. I know. You're not a private investigator. No. I'm a brand strategist who reads documents carefully. He kept his voice even. I'm not saying I know what happened. I'm saying there's a timeline that deserves a better look than it got. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the December light outside the window shifted slightly. Why are you telling me this? Because I work for you, he said. And because... He stopped, started again. Because somebody should have told you sooner. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away toward the windows, toward the city outside. Her jaw was set. Her hands were flat and steady now. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and did not shake at all. I want everything you found, every document. I want it tonight. I'll send it over. And Nathan. She didn't look at him. Don't tell anyone else. Not yet. Understood. He gathered his things and left, and walked to the elevator, and stood in it going down through the floors of the building she had built, and thought about a car going off a rain-slicked bridge in the dark, and a woman who'd spent 2 years thinking it was an accident. He didn't sleep well that night. Sophie came in at 6:30 in the morning and found him already awake in the kitchen, coffee in hand, staring at his laptop screen. She assessed the situation with the accuracy of someone who had been studying this particular adult for 7 years. Did something bad happen? She asked. Something complicated happened, he said. She climbed onto the stool across from him and poured herself cereal with the focused care she brought to tasks she was still developing. Is it the lady from the tall building? Yeah. Is she okay? He thought about Elena's face in the office yesterday, the stillness of it, the quality of someone absorbing a very heavy thing and deciding what shape to make of it. She's going to be, he said. He believed that, which surprised him a little. Sophie ate her cereal. After a minute, she said, She's nice, Dad, even though she doesn't show it a lot. I know. The kind of nice that's in there even when people can't see it. Nathan looked at his daughter across the kitchen table in the early winter light, this small, serious person who noticed everything. Yeah, he said. That's exactly right. She nodded as though this settled something, and went back to her cereal, and Nathan turned back to his laptop, and outside the window, Chicago was gray and cold, and the day had barely started. He had a lot of work left to do. Elena called him at 9 p.m. that night. He was putting Sophie to bed. They were on the 3rd chapter of a book about a girl who discovered a door in her grandmother's basement, which Sophie had declared very stressful in the way she described books she loved. And he saw Elena's name on his phone and told Sophie he'd be right back. In the hallway, he picked up. Hey, I went through everything you sent. Her voice was steady, controlled, the way concrete is controlled. There's more. I found things in those board records I have access to that you didn't have. Things I hadn't looked at carefully because I hadn't known to look. A pause. Nathan, the week before the accident, Castle sent a message to Pharaoh that referenced a conversation with someone named Gregor. I don't know a Gregor. There's no Gregor in any of our employment records or contractor files. He sat down on the hallway floor with his back against the wall. Okay. So the message says he heard paper or something like it, her reading it. It says, the timing needs to work around the board schedule. Gregor confirms Tuesday is viable. After Tuesday, there won't be a succession question. She stopped reading. The silence was the kind that had weight. My accident was on a Tuesday. He stayed very still. Elena. I know. Her voice didn't crack, but it was thinner at the edges. I know what it looks like. You need a lawyer. Not your company's legal team, your own lawyer. Someone who has no relationship to the board. I have someone in mind. A breath. What do I do in the meantime? I have a board meeting in 3 weeks. You act normal. You don't change anything. You don't let them know you're looking. He thought for a second. Can you get me into the board records you have access to? I want to build a complete timeline, everything. I'll have Claire set up access tomorrow morning. Good. He shifted against the wall. Down the hallway, Sophie's light was still on. She was waiting. Elena, you're going to want to call someone tonight. Someone who knows you. You shouldn't sit with this alone. A pause. I don't really have... She stopped. He understood what she'd stopped before saying. He didn't push on it. Then call me if you need to, okay? I'll pick up. Another pause, longer. You have a kid. She goes to sleep eventually. Call if you need to. He hung up and sat in the hallway for another minute, phone in hand, looking at nothing. The apartment was warm and quiet. Sophie's light fell across the hallway floor in a yellow stripe. He thought about what it meant to sit alone in a big apartment at night, having found out that the worst thing that had ever happened to you might not have been an accident. And he thought about the fact that when he'd said, "Call me," she hadn't said no. He got up and went back to Sophie's room and picked up the book where they'd left off. The Girl in Her Grandmother's Basement, the door that opened somewhere complicated and strange. Sophie settled against his shoulder and he read, and his voice was steady, and the night went on. The way nights do, 1 minute at a time. Outside the window, the city quiet and cold and indifferent. Inside this small room, two people who'd found each other after hard things, reading a story about what happens when you go through the door anyway. The lawyer's name was Margaret Osai, and she came recommended by Elena's college roommate, which meant she had no connection to Whitmore Group's corporate history, no relationship with the board, and no reason to be careful about whose feelings she protected. She was 53, had been doing corporate litigation for 26 years, and when Elena laid out what Nathan had found, and what she'd subsequently found herself, Margaret listened without interrupting for 40 minutes, and then said, "You need to understand what we're dealing with before we do anything. If this goes where I think it goes, the way you move matters as much as what you have." They met in Margaret's office on a Saturday morning, which Margaret had agreed to without complaint. Nathan was there because Elena had asked him to be, and because the documents had originally been his, and because, though neither of them said this explicitly, Elena had found it easier to say difficult things out loud when there was someone in the room who already knew the shape of the situation. "What you have right now," Margaret said, spreading the documents across her conference table with the practiced arrangement of someone who'd done this many times, "is circumstantial. Strong circumstantial, but not sufficient on its own. The Castle conflict of interest is the cleanest piece. That's documentable. That's a fiduciary breach, and that alone is enough to remove him from the board. The Gregor message is more complicated." "Because we don't know who Gregor is," Elena said. "Because we don't know who Gregor is, and because one message referencing a Tuesday isn't a confession. It's suggestive. A good defense attorney makes it look like coincidence in 45 minutes. Margaret looked at both of them. "What we need is Gregor, or we need one of the three to make a mistake." "How do we find Gregor?" Nathan asked. "We start with the phone records from that period. If Castle was communicating with someone about this, there's a trail somewhere. Calls, emails, payments? I have an investigator I work with. She's good, and she's quiet." Margaret paused. "The question is timing. You have a board meeting in 18 days, Elena said. Then we have 18 days to either have enough to move on or decide we need more time and find a reason to delay the meeting." She looked at Elena directly. "I need you to understand something. If we go at the board meeting and we don't have enough, we tip them off and they prepare. If we have something solid and we move at the board meeting, we control the room and the narrative simultaneously. There's no middle option that ends well." Elena nodded. Nathan had watched her in this meeting with the particular attention he'd developed over 2 months, watching for the points where she checked out, where the wall came up, where the thing became too much and she retreated into the clipped efficiency that was her version of armor. She hadn't done it once in 40 minutes. She was present for all of it, even the hard parts, and her questions were precise, and her expression was focused in the way of someone who has decided that paying attention is the only thing she can control. "What do you need from me?" Elena asked. "Everything you have access to. Board communications, financial records going back 3 years, vendor contracts that involved any of the three. And I need you to behave completely normally for the next 18 days. Nothing changes. You don't look at them differently in meetings. You don't avoid them. You don't ask questions that suggest you're looking." "I've been managing Richard Castle for 2 years, Elena said flatly. "I can manage him for 18 more days. Margaret smiled briefly, the smile of someone who liked their clients to have this quality. "Good." Outside, on the sidewalk, in the cold January air, Elena didn't speak for a moment. Nathan stood beside her while Claire pulled the car around, and the city moved past them with its Saturday morning quality, lighter than the week, easier in its rhythm. "This is real," Elena said. Not a question, more like something she was confirming for herself. "Yeah." I've spent 2 years thinking I drove off that bridge because of rain and a barrier that wasn't rated right. She was looking straight ahead. Her voice was even, but her hands on the wheelchair rims were tight. I spent 2 years. I know. I went to therapy for 4 months after the accident, and I quit because I kept telling the therapist I was fine, and eventually she believed me. A short, hard exhale. I wasn't fine. I just didn't want to be in a room talking about how I felt about an accident, because I thought it was an accident. Nathan thought about saying something and decided that this was one of the moments where silence was more honest. He just stayed there beside her in the January cold. After a minute, Elena said, "What time does Sophie's school day end?" The question surprised him. 2:30. Why? She glanced at him sideways. I've been in this city for 10 years, and I've never been to the Museum of Science and Industry. He looked at her. You want to go to a children's museum? I want to go to a museum that is not directly connected to anything I am currently dealing with. Sophie seems like this kind of person who would have opinions about exhibits. She has opinions about everything, Nathan said. Fair warning. I've noticed. He pulled out his phone and called the school. Sophie's opinion of the coal mine exhibit was that it was extremely stressful in a good way. Her opinion of the submarine was that it was too small for this many people and also awesome. Her opinion of the weather station was detailed and took 9 minutes to deliver, incorporating everything she'd learned in her second-grade science unit with the additions she'd collected from books. Nathan was only partially aware she'd been reading. Elena listened to all of it, not in the polite, performative way that adults listen to children. The nodding and the half-attention and the waiting for the child to finish so conversation could resume. She actually listened, asked follow-up questions, remembered what Sophie had said 3 exhibits back, and connected it to what she was saying now. Sophie noticed. Sophie always noticed things like that. By the 3rd exhibit, she had positioned herself close to Elena's chair rather than ranging ahead the way she usually did, and Nathan watched his daughter make the small, instinctive adjustment of a child who has decided someone is worth staying near. They spent 3 hours there. Nathan bought the overpriced museum hot chocolate because it was January, and Sophie asked with the particular strategic precision of a child who knew the conditions were optimal, and they sat in the atrium with the big glass ceiling showing the gray winter sky above them. The 3 of them around a small table, Sophie explaining to Elena why hot chocolate was superior to coffee as a beverage in a way that was thorough and, frankly, not wrong. Coffee is bitter, Sophie said. Coffee is complex, Elena said. That's what adults say about things that taste bad. Elena looked at Nathan. She's not wrong. She's not wrong about most things, Nathan said, which she will now store and use later. I already stored it, Sophie confirmed. Elena laughed. A real one. Not the almost thing from the office, not the controlled exhale, but an actual laugh, quick and unguarded, and she seemed to notice it happening only after it had happened, and she didn't shut it down. She let it sit there for a second, in the air of the museum atrium, and then picked up her hot chocolate. Sophie watched her with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose work here was complete. On the way out, while Sophie was in the bathroom and Nathan was waiting near the coat check, Elena said, She's remarkable, you know. I know. He glanced toward the bathroom hallway. She came out that way mostly. I can't take much credit for it. You can take more than you think. She said it simply, without the quality of a compliment, more as an observation. The way she talks to people, the way she pays attention, that's learned. Kids learn it from somewhere. He didn't know what to say to that, which didn't happen to him very often. He looked at the middle distance for a second. Her mom leaving was hard, he said, on both of us. Sophie was 5. She didn't really understand it, and then she did understand it, and then she decided to be okay about it. He paused. I don't know if I taught her that, or if she taught me. Elena was quiet for a moment. After the accident, she said slowly, everyone around me was very focused on what I had lost. My mobility, my previous life, the version of myself that existed before. Nobody, she stopped, started again. Nobody thought to ask what I could still do, what was still there. Nathan looked at her. You did eventually, she said. You didn't make a production of it. You just talked to me like it was obvious. She was looking toward the entrance, not at him. I didn't know how much I needed that until I had it. Sophie came back from the bathroom at that particular moment, coat half on and one boot untied, and the conversation folded back into the practical, the way conversations with 7-year-olds made everything practical. But Nathan carried what Elena had said with him out into the January cold, and he thought about it on the drive home, Sophie asleep in the back seat by the time they reached the highway, the city dark and lit outside the windows. The 18 days were the longest of Nathan's professional life, and some of the more complicated of his personal one. Margaret's investigator, a woman named Sal, who communicated exclusively in brief texts and occasional phone calls that lasted under 3 minutes, found Gregor in 11 days. His full name was Gregor Vanich, and he was not in any of Whitmore Group's employment records because he had never worked for Whitmore Group. He had worked, briefly and as an independent contractor, for a private security and investigation firm called Morrow Consulting, which had closed its Chicago office in the year following Elena's accident and consolidated operations to a non-publicized address in Denver. Morrow Consulting had received 3 payments from a holding company that Margaret's team traced back, through 2 layers of corporate structure, to an entity in which Richard Castle held a 40% stake. The payments totaled $230,000, made in the 4 months bracketing the date of Elena's accident. Nathan was in his apartment when the summary document came through on a Tuesday night. Sophie was asleep. He read it twice and then called Elena. She picked up on the second ring. I saw it. Margaret sent it to you too. 20 minutes ago. Her voice was completely controlled, the kind of control that costs something. Nathan, they paid someone to... I know. $230,000, and I spent 2 years... She stopped. He heard her breathe. 2 years thinking I was unlucky. 2 years of not leaving my office and not doing public appearances and pulling back from everything because I thought I was fragile. Because the accident made me feel fragile. Elena. And they did it on purpose. The control was still there, but something underneath it was coming through. Not breaking through, but visible. They sat in my board meetings for 2 years and looked at me, and they did it on purpose. Yes. There was nothing else to say. The facts were the facts. A long silence. He didn't fill it. I want to be in that room, she said finally. The shareholders' meeting. I want to be the one who says it. Margaret was going to recommend. I know what Margaret was going to recommend. I want to be the one. Her voice had shifted, the controlled quality becoming something else. Not anger exactly, though anger was in there. Something more like resolution. The quality of someone who has found solid ground after a long time without it. They tried to take this company from me. They tried to take everything from me. I'm not going to be in a waiting room while a lawyer handles it. He thought about it. About the risk and about what Margaret would say, and about the fact that he'd watched Elena Whitmore walk into a room with Gerald Pratt and the Hargrove team and take the meeting apart and put it back together in her favor. And that had been before she knew all of this, before this had turned into fuel. Okay, he said. You'll help me prepare. Yeah, I will. Another silence, shorter. Thank you, she said, for finding it. You didn't have to look that hard. I was reading documents, he said. It's not Nathan. The way she said his name made him stop. Thank you. He stayed quiet for a second. Try to sleep, he said. We have a week. The shareholders' annual meeting for Whitmore Group was held in the company's main conference center on the 41st floor, a room that seated 80 and today held 63. Shareholders, board members, senior executives, legal representatives, and 3 people who were not on the official attendee list, but whom Margaret had arranged to be present through a process Nathan didn't fully understand and had decided not to ask about. He arrived 90 minutes early with Elena and Claire and Margaret and spent the time going through the presentation one final time in a small room off the main corridor. The presentation was Nathan's work, built from the documents, structured to move from the Castle conflict of interest, clean, documentable, the thing that required the least interpretation, through the Morrow Consulting payments and their paper trail, and into the Gregor communications. Margaret had prepared supplementary legal briefs that had been distributed that morning to a federal investigator, because Margaret had decided 2 weeks ago that the appropriate next step was not a civil proceeding, but a criminal referral, and she had made that referral, and the people she'd referred it to were among those not on the official attendee list. Castle, Farrow, and Holm were already in the main room when Elena arrived, which Nathan had been watching for. He wanted to see their faces when they saw her. He stood near the door and watched. Castle, who was 61 and had the professional ease of a man who had spent decades being the most powerful person in most rooms, registered Elena's arrival with a nod that was perfectly calibrated. Respectful, slightly warm, the performance of someone who had nothing to hide. His eyes did not change. Farrow looked down at his phone. Holmes smiled the smile of someone whose smile had been worked on over a long career. Elena looked at none of them directly. She moved to her position at the front of the room with Claire and arranged herself and her materials and spoke briefly to Margaret and then sat in the particular quality of stillness she had when she was ready, when she had decided something and there was no longer any uncertainty in it. Nathan took his seat near the back. He had no formal role today. He was here because she had asked him to be. The meeting opened with standard procedural matters. The CFO presented the annual financial summary. Strong numbers, the company's recovery over the past quarter evident in the data. Nathan watched the room. Castle listened with the air of someone in his regular seat. Farrow checked his phone twice and put it away. The 60 or so shareholders who were not part of the conspiracy watched with the attention of people whose money was in the room. Then Elena spoke. She didn't begin with the accusation. She began with the company, its history, its founding, the years that had built it into what it was. She spoke about it the way she'd spoken to Sophie about her job, with specificity and care, and without softening, the love of it legible in every particular detail. Nathan watched the room listen. He watched the way people who owned pieces of this company leaned slightly forward as she talked about it, the recognition on their faces of something they'd been waiting to hear, the person who built it still being in it, still caring about it that much. She talked for 7 minutes about the company. Then she said, 2 years ago, I drove off a bridge on a Tuesday night in November. The investigation concluded it was road conditions, wet pavement, an inadequate barrier, an accident. She paused. The room was very still. I believe that. I spent 2 years believing it, and I want to tell you honestly that it changed me in ways I'm still accounting for. It made me pull back, made me smaller than I intended to be. I want to name that because it matters to what I'm about to tell you. She looked at the room. Not at Cassell, not yet. What I'm about to present to you is a documented record of a coordinated effort by 3 members of this board, Richard Castle, Dennis Farrow, and Patricia Holm, to undermine this company's leadership and, I believe, to arrange the incident that put me in this wheelchair. The room reacted. Not chaos. The room was too professional for chaos, but a quality of electricity, of breath, of people who had come to a shareholders' meeting and found something else entirely. Nathan watched Cassell's face. The professional ease cracked, just along the edges, something underneath it becoming briefly visible before the management came back down. Elena didn't look at him yet. She pressed play on the presentation. Nathan had built it to be irrefutable. Not dramatic. He'd resisted the instinct to make it cinematic, because cinematic was easy to argue against. He'd made it clear, one fact after another, in sequence, with the documentation visible and the sourcing attributed and nothing that required the audience to make a leap. The conflict of interest first, Castle's family stake in Landway Solutions, the preferred vendor agreement, the dollar figures, the board votes. 9 minutes of facts that said one board member had been voting against the company's interest to protect $8 million of annual personal income. Farrow stood up at minute 6. This is completely out of order. Sit down, Dennis. Elena's voice was level, not loud. You'll have time to respond. He sat down. Something about her voice made him sit down, the quality of it. Not threatening, just completely certain. The room heard it. The presentation continued. The Morrow Consulting section, the payments, the corporate structure traced back to Castle's holding entity, the Gregor Communications, the timeline, the Tuesday. By the time Elena finished speaking, the room had the quality of a place where something irreversible had happened. You could feel it in the way people were sitting, the stillness of it. Margaret stood and handed documents to the 2 federal investigators who had been sitting at the back of the room with the quiet non-presence of people who were very good at being unobtrusive. They were no longer unobtrusive. Castle's lawyer, He'd brought a lawyer, Nathan noted, which was interesting for a man attending a routine shareholders meeting, was on his feet immediately. Holm was very white. Farrow had his phone out and then put it away when one of the investigators looked at him. Richard Castle, Dennis Farrow, and Patricia Holm, Margaret said, addressing them with the directness of someone who had been waiting to do this for 3 weeks, are formally requested to remain available for federal questioning. Counsel has been served with the relevant documentation. She looked at Cassell specifically. I'd recommend not leaving the building until that conversation has concluded. What followed was not swift. None of it was swift. There were lawyers and procedure and a great deal of controlled noise. 3 of the 63 people in the room had to be separated into different spaces for questioning. The remaining 60 had the particular quality of witnesses, people who had been present when something important happened and were still processing what they'd seen. Elena sat at the front of the room through all of it, answering questions, working through the procedural requirements, responding to the board members who were not under investigation with the clear-eyed precision of someone who had prepared for every version of this conversation. She was in her element in the way Nathan had seen from the beginning. This was what she did. This was the room she was built for. And the difference today was that the wall was down, not because the circumstances weren't hard, because she'd decided the wall had cost her more than it had saved. Nathan stayed near the back. At one point, around hour 2 of the proceedings, Claire appeared beside him and said quietly, "She wanted me to check that you were still here." He looked across the room at Elena, who was speaking to 2 remaining board members, her back straight, her voice calm. "I'm here," he said. Claire nodded and went back. It was after 6 when the room finally emptied enough for the proceedings to move to formal venues, the investigators having collected what they needed for the moment. The board members who remained beginning the work of figuring out what came next, Margaret managing the downstream logistics with the efficiency of someone in her preferred environment. Nathan was putting on his coat near the windows when Elena came up beside him. The room was nearly empty. Outside, Chicago was dark. The lights of the city spread below them in every direction. "It's done," she said. "First part of it," he said. "There'll be more." "I know." She looked out at the city. "I'm not afraid of the more." He believed her. He looked at her profile, the steadiness of her, the quality of someone who had come through a very particular fire and was still standing in it but wasn't burned by it anymore. He thought about 2 months ago, the first meeting, the woman who wouldn't leave her office for lunch, who'd said I'm less with a flatness that meant she'd accepted it as true. "The rehabilitation program," he said. "The one you turned down. The advanced one." She was quiet for a moment. "Dr. Selena Carr's program at Northwestern." She said the name like it was something she'd kept at a distance for a long time. "I was evaluated for it 14 months ago. She thought I was a candidate." "What did you think?" "I thought—" She stopped, started again. "I thought it didn't matter. What was the point of trying to walk again if—" She didn't finish the sentence, but he understood the end of it. If the accident had not been an accident, there was no version of it that made sense to fight towards something. If the accident had been done to her on purpose, to remove her, then fighting towards something felt like being naive about where she was and what had been done. "The point," Nathan said carefully, "is that it's yours. Whatever happens with Cassell, whatever happens with the investigation, your body is yours. What you can do with it is yours." She looked at him. He met her gaze and didn't look away. "I'm going to call Dr. Akar," she said, not as a question or a test, as a statement of something decided. "Good," he said. She looked back out at the city. The lights were very clear tonight, the winter air having done something to the atmosphere that made everything sharper. She sat in the quiet for a moment, and Nathan stood beside her, and they didn't say anything else for a while, which was its own kind of communication. 2 people who had gotten through a hard thing together and were now standing in the space on the other side of it, not sure yet what it was, but sure that it was. He told Sophie that night in the imprecise but honest way he tried to tell her things. "The meeting went okay," he said. "The people who were causing problems are going to be held accountable." Sophie was brushing her teeth, which meant her response was partially obstructed, but the gist of it was, "Is Elena okay?" "She's okay. She was actually—" He thought about it. "She was impressive today." Sophie spat, rinsed, considered. I told you she was nice. You told me she was the kind of nice that's in there even when people can't see it. Yes, Sophie said, with the patience of someone who had already established this and did not understand why it was being revisited. And I was right. He turned off her light and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, the way he did most nights, long enough for her to settle, and he thought about the day and about all the days that had built to it, and about Elena's face when she'd said, I'm going to call Dr. Akar, the way it had looked like something opening rather than something closing. Dad? Sophie's voice was getting slow with sleep. Yeah? Is she going to be okay? Like, really okay? Not just okay. He thought about a woman who had found out the worst thing she believed about herself wasn't true, that she was not unlucky, not fragile, not the person the accident had made her feel she was, and who had stood up in a room of 60 people and said the true thing, clearly, without shaking. He thought about what it meant to build yourself back from something that had been done to you, and how much harder that was, and also how much more meaningful than recovering from something random. Yeah, he said, really okay. Sophie made a small, satisfied sound and was asleep within 2 minutes, which was a thing she could still do that Nathan envied with his whole heart. He sat in the dark for a little longer than usual, his daughters breathing evening out beside him, the city going on outside the window, and he thought that something had ended today and something had begun, and that he wasn't entirely sure yet what either of those things would turn out to mean, but that he wasn't afraid of finding out. Dr. Selena Carr ran her rehabilitation program out of a facility attached to Northwestern's medical complex, a place that smelled like a hospital but had been deliberately designed to not look like one. Natural light, plants that were actually alive, a physical therapy floor with high ceilings, and equipment that Nathan, when he first saw it, thought looked less like medical machinery and more like something from a very serious athletic training center. Dr. Akar herself was 44, Turkish-American, and had the particular quality of someone who was both very warm and not at all willing to let you get away with things. She'd been Elena's evaluating physician 14 months earlier, and she received Elena's call in early January with something Claire later described as professional satisfaction that was barely professional. The program was 3 days a week, mornings, for an initial 12-week commitment. It was not guaranteed to produce results. Dr. Akar was careful about that. The neurological damage from the accident had been significant, and the 2-year gap between the accident and the start of intensive rehabilitation was a real variable. I want you to understand, she told Elena at their first session, with Nathan and Claire present, because Elena had asked them to be, that the goal of this program is not a specific physical outcome. The goal is to find the maximum of what your body can do. That maximum might be more than you expect. It might be less. We don't know yet. What do you think it is? Elena asked. I think you have more than you've been using. I think 2 years of reduced activity and psychological withdrawal from your physical self has cost you capability that the original injury didn't take. She said it directly, without cushioning. I think the injury was serious, and the aftermath made it worse. That's recoverable, partially. How much? We'll find out. Elena nodded. When do we start? We already did, Dr. Akar said, and wheeled a piece of equipment into position. Nathan drove Elena to the first 4 sessions because Claire had a family situation and the alternative was a car service, which Elena said she preferred not to deal with, which Nathan thought probably meant she didn't want to be alone in a car with a stranger before going to do something she found difficult. He didn't say that. He just drove. The sessions were 60 to 90 minutes, and Elena came out of them with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been asked to do something very hard with parts of themselves they'd stopped expecting much from. She didn't talk about what happened inside on the drive back, not in detail, but she talked around it, the way people talk about things they're still sorting. She said things like, "It's stranger than I expected, and I keep being surprised by what still works." And once, staring out the window at the February cityscape, I forgot what it felt like to try. He didn't push on any of it. He drove and occasionally said something and mostly let the drives be what they were. A space between the session and the rest of the day, a decompression. The city moving past the windows at a pace that allowed for thinking. On the 5th session, he had a conflict, a client presentation that couldn't move, and Claire drove instead. Nathan texted Elena that afternoon. How was it? She texted back 40 minutes later. Hard. Also, she thinks there may be more sensation in my left leg than the previous assessments found. Too early to know what it means. He read it 3 times and then typed, That's something. She replied, Maybe. Don't make it into something yet. Okay, he typed. And then, but noted. A pause. Then, noted. He put his phone down and got back to his presentation and spent the rest of the afternoon slightly less present in it than he should have been. Mum. The investigation moved through the winter with the particular pace of federal proceedings, slower than anyone wanted, more thorough than anyone expected, and generating a low continuous hum of legal activity that Margaret managed with the expertise of someone who had spent her career in rooms where this kind of thing happened. Castle, Farrow, and Holm had all retained counsel, and the board had convened an emergency session in the days following the shareholders' meeting and voted to place all 3 on administrative leave pending the investigation, a vote that passed 9-0 with 3 abstentions, which was the board's way of saying they believed what they'd heard and were willing to act on it, but not willing to go on record about it with more specificity than necessary. The criminal referral was in the hands of the federal investigators. The civil liability question was in Margaret's hands. Gregor Vanich had been located in Denver and had immediately hired a lawyer, which Margaret said was actually good news, because lawyers who were hired immediately in situations like this tended to be lawyers who were facilitating cooperation discussions, and a Vanich cooperation agreement would make the case against Castle concrete in ways that the paper trail alone could not. Nathan received updates through Elena, who received them through Margaret, and tried to stay appropriately in his lane about the legal dimensions of it while remaining fully present for the business dimensions, which were considerable. Whitmore Group needed a board reconstitution. It needed a communication strategy for investors who had watched 3 directors placed on administrative leave and had questions. It needed Nathan to do the job he'd originally been hired to do, which had now expanded significantly past the original scope. He did all of it. He was good at all of it. But the thing that occupied him most, in the margins of the work, in the drives to the rehabilitation facility and the texts in the evenings and the Saturdays at the museum that had become a sporadic but recurring thing, was watching Elena come back to herself. It happened in increments. He wouldn't have seen it if he hadn't been paying attention, and he was paying attention. Small things first. She started leaving the office for lunch more consistently, sometimes with Claire, occasionally alone, once with one of her senior directors, which Claire mentioned with the tone of someone reporting a meaningful development. She started asking questions about things that had nothing to do with business. She asked Nathan once, with a slightly careful quality like she was aware the question was out of character, what his favorite part of Chicago was in winter. He'd said the river, when it was frozen, the way the ice changed the sound of the city. She'd said she hadn't seen the river frozen in 2 years. He'd said they should fix that. They fixed it on a Saturday in late February. He and Sophie and Elena on the Riverwalk, the ice on the water doing the particular blue-gray thing it did in the flat winter light. Sophie had strong opinions about the ice formations near the bridge supports. Elena listened to them with the full attention quality Nathan had come to recognize as one of the things about her that was entirely unchanged from who she'd been before all of it. She had always listened that way, he suspected. It had just been directed only at things that mattered professionally for 2 years, and it was now directing itself at other things, too. At Sophie explaining ice physics with incomplete but enthusiastic accuracy, and at the city around her, and at the texture of an afternoon that had no agenda. On the walk back to the car, Elena said to Sophie, "What's your favorite season?" Sophie thought about it with appropriate gravity. "Summer, because of the pool, but also fall because of the leaves. So probably both." "That's 2. "I know. I have a lot of favorites. It's a flaw." Elena glanced at Nathan. "Where does she get that?" "I genuinely don't know," Nathan said. "I'm a very decisive person." Sophie made the noise she made when she didn't bother articulating her skepticism because her face was doing it already. Elena laughed, and this time she didn't seem surprised by it. It had been happening more regularly over the past weeks, the laugh arriving and staying for its full duration instead of being shut down. Nathan noticed things like that. He noticed too many things and was beginning to understand what that meant. and was not entirely sure what to do with the understanding. But in March, Whitmore Group announced the appointment of a restructured board, 7 members, 3 of whom were new, including a former federal trade commissioner and a logistics industry veteran whose reputation Nathan had spent a week vetting before recommending her. The announcement went out with a statement from Elena that Nathan had helped draft, though in the end, most of what remained in the final version was hers. She wrote directly, with the same quality as she spoke. No circumlocution, no defensive softening, the thing said as it was. The investor response was cautiously positive. The cautious part Nathan had expected. The positive part was more than he'd hoped for. The way Elena had handled the shareholders' meeting, the directness of it, the decision to be in the room herself, the way she'd spoken about the company before she'd spoken about the conspiracy, had landed differently than a purely legal or procedural response would have. It landed like character, like someone who was what she said she was, running the thing she'd built, dealing with what had been done with her eyes open. He was in Elena's office reviewing the investor response analysis when she said, without looking up from the document she was reading, "I want to talk to you about something." "Okay." "Not now, this evening. Do you have time?" He had planned to pick up Sophie and go home and make something for dinner that Sophie would declare was good, but not as good as the tacos, which was her standard for home cooking. He said, "I have time." They met at 7, after Sophie was at Mrs. Adebayo's, who was doing better and had resumed her role in Nathan's childcare ecosystem with characteristic warmth. And Nathan had changed out of his work clothes into something less specifically professional, which felt strange in a way he didn't examine closely. Elena had suggested a wine bar in the West Loop that she'd apparently been to exactly once, 2 years before the accident, and had thought about going back to for a long time. It was quiet on a Thursday evening. They got a corner table. The wine was good. Elena ordered without hesitation, which Nathan had noticed she did about everything. She was a person who knew what she wanted, and it had simply been applied to a narrower and narrower set of things over the past 2 years, and was now expanding back out. She let the small talk run for a few minutes. The investor response, something Claire had said that had been unexpectedly funny, a question about Sophie's current feelings on the classroom pet question, and then she set her glass down and said, "I want to offer you a permanent position." He looked at her. "Chief Strategy Officer," she said. "It's a role that doesn't currently exist. I'd create it. You'd be responsible for long-term strategic direction, partnership development, and—" She paused. "And I'd want your perspective on the board, not as a voting member, but present. Your instinct for the things that don't show up in financial reports it's something the company needs." He was quiet for a moment. "Elena, the compensation would be significantly better than what Colton and Reed are paying you, but Claire prepared a preliminary offer if you want to see the numbers." "I don't need to see the numbers yet." He turned his glass. "Is this about the work?" She met his eyes. "Mostly." "Mostly." "You're good at the work," she said. "You're the best strategic thinker I've worked with, and I've worked with a lot of them." "That's true. And it's the professional reason." She held his gaze. "The other reason is that I've built this company for 10 years, and I've been very good at not letting things matter to me that weren't the company. And the past few months have—" She stopped, started over. "You showed up, and you told the truth, and you stayed. You didn't perform concern and then bill for it. You actually stayed." The wine bar was quiet around them, a few other tables, low music. He thought about the first meeting in her office, the 45 minutes of clipped professional interaction, the way she'd said you have 45 minutes as a statement of the terms. He thought about the hallway at the museum, what she'd said about being talked to like a person. "I would need to think about it," he said. "I know. It's a big change, not just professionally." She understood what he meant. He could see that she understood. "I know that too," she said. "I'm not asking you to decide tonight." "What are you asking me tonight?" She was quiet for a second. Outside the window, the Chicago street did its evening thing. People moving past in their coats, a cab, the lit windows of the buildings across the way. "I'm asking if you want to stay," she said, "in whatever form makes sense. I'm asking because she should have asked sooner, and I wasn't sure how." He looked at her across the table, this person he'd watched build herself back from something that would have ended most people, who'd sat in a room of 60 and said the true thing without shaking, who'd laughed in a museum atrium and not shut it down, who'd said, "I forgot what it felt like to try in a car with the February city outside the window." "I want to stay," he said. She nodded once, and something in her settled almost imperceptibly, the way a room settles when a door that's been slightly open finally either opens all the way or closes, and in this case it was opening. "Then we'll work out the rest." They stayed another hour, talked about things that weren't work. His childhood in Ohio, her early years in the city when she'd been building Whitmore Group on no sleep and bad coffee, and the particular fuel of someone who has decided to prove something and doesn't know yet that proving something is not the same as living. She talked about her parents, her mother in particular, who had died when Elena was 24 and never saw what the company became. She said this without the flatness of a thing that had been sanitized by time. It still had weight. She let it have weight. And Nathan said he was sorry and meant it, and she said she knew, and that was all that needed to be said about it. He drove home with the windows down despite the March cold, which Sophie would have considered irrational, and which he found he needed for some reason he didn't fully articulate to himself. The city went past. He thought about what it meant to stay, in a job, in a life, in proximity to someone who had come to matter. He thought he'd been in proximity to her for 4 months and had watched her go from a woman who wouldn't leave her building for lunch to a woman who ordered wine without hesitation in a place she'd been wanting to return to for 2 years. He thought that was something. He thought he might be in a certain amount of trouble, which was not an unpleasant kind of trouble. He told Sophie the next morning at breakfast that he'd been offered a new job and was thinking about it. Sophie ate her cereal and thought about it. "At Elena's company?" she said. "Yeah." "Would you still bring me sometimes?" "Probably less. It would be an actual job there, not visiting." Sophie considered. "But you'd still see her?" "Every day, yeah." "Good." She ate another spoonful. "She needs people who see her, like actually see her. Not just—" She made a vague gesture that nonetheless communicated something specific, the gesture of someone who had spent enough time in adult professional environments to understand the difference between being present and actually being there. Nathan looked at his daughter, this 7-year-old who was going to be either a therapist or a federal prosecutor, and felt the specific pride of a parent watching their child be exactly who they are. "You're right," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you going to take it?" "I think so." She nodded, satisfied, and returned to her cereal. "Good. Also, can we go back to the museum? I want to see the weather thing again." "Yeah," he said. "We can do that." Dr. Akar called Elena in the 4th week of March, a Friday afternoon, and asked her to come in on Monday for an assessment rather than a regular session. She said it in the way that medical professionals say things when the thing they have to say is significant and they've decided to be careful about how they say it. Elena texted Nathan, "Akar wants to do a formal assessment Monday." She wouldn't say why over the phone. He texted back, "Do you want me to come?" A pause that lasted 4 minutes, which was long for Elena. Then, "If you can." He rearranged his Monday morning. The assessment was 90 minutes. Nathan sat in the waiting area with Claire and read nothing on his phone. He was not actually capable of reading anything on his phone. He looked at the plants, which were doing well, and thought about the things he'd overheard Dr. Akar say in the early weeks of the program. The 2 years of psychological withdrawal had cost Elena physical capability that wasn't necessarily gone. He thought about what it meant to discover that a wall you'd built to protect yourself had also been keeping out things you needed. Elena came out of the assessment with Dr. Akar beside her and her face in the careful neutral configuration that Nathan had learned to read not as absence, but as the presence of something being held very steady. Dr. Akar was not neutral. She was doing a specific kind of professional composure that did not entirely contain what was underneath it. They sat in Dr. Akar's office, all 4 of them. Dr. Akar set a tablet on the desk with data Nathan couldn't fully interpret and said, "The neurological recovery over the past 11 weeks is measurable and significant. The sensation in your left leg has increased substantially, and the motor signal pathways we thought were fully compromised are showing activity." She paused. "Elena, this is more than I expected this quickly." Elena's hands were flat on her knees. What does it mean? It means I think you're a candidate for an intensive parallel program, physical therapy and neurological stimulation, that I'd want to run for another 8 weeks, intensively. Daily sessions, and at the end of those 8 weeks, she stopped, which was not something Dr. Akar did lightly. I believe there is a real possibility that you will be able to stand with support, and potentially, to take assisted steps. The room was very quiet. You're not telling me I'll walk, Elena said. I'm telling you I think you have more ahead of you than the original prognosis suggested. I don't promise outcomes. I promise we find the maximum. Dr. Akar met her eyes. But Elena, the maximum appears to be higher than we thought. Elena said nothing for a moment. Nathan watched her face go through something that had too many layers to name. The years of the prognosis she'd accepted. The therapy she'd quit. The 2 years of smaller and smaller life built around a body she'd decided was fixed. And now this. Now a number that was different from the number she'd been given. 8 weeks, she said. Starting next Monday, if you agree. I agree, Elena said. She said it immediately, which was not something Nathan had noticed her do about things that were hard. She usually held hard things for a second before answering. This time, she didn't hold it at all. Like she'd decided before she came in, or before the question was asked, or maybe weeks ago, on a different Monday, in a different room, when she'd said, I'm going to call Dr. Akar. In the parking structure afterward, before Claire pulled the car around, Elena sat in the gray concrete quiet and didn't say anything for a moment. Nathan stood nearby. I told myself after the accident, she said, that I was being practical, accepting the reality, not deluding myself with false hope. She looked at the middle distance. I think I was just scared. Yeah, he said, probably both. You're not going to tell me the fear was understandable? The fear was absolutely understandable, and it cost you 2 years. He said it straight, not cruelly, just as the true thing. She'd told him once that she needed people who told the true thing. She looked at him. Yes, she said. It did. And then, after a pause, 8 weeks? 8 weeks, he said. Okay. The 8 weeks were the hardest and the most important, and Nathan was not present for most of them. He was present in the way that he'd always been present. The texts, the occasional drive, the Monday morning standing meetings that had become a fixed point in both their schedules. But the daily sessions were Elena's alone, and he understood that was appropriate, that this was the thing only she could do, that his role here was to be available and not to try to make it something he was part of in ways he wasn't. What he was part of was the company, which had entered a period of motion that was the best kind, purposeful, forward, built on solid ground. He had accepted the CSO position formally in late March, given notice at Colton and Reed, and transitioned with the particular uncomplicated competence of someone moving toward something rather than away from it. His office was 2 floors below Elena's, which Claire had noted was the floor that had the better coffee machine, which was either a coincidence or a very considered decision, and Nathan had decided not to ask. The work was good. He was good at it. The strategic framework he and Elena developed over March and April had the quality of 2 people who had gotten through hard things together and had built, in the getting through, a working language for what the company was and what it could be. She disagreed with him regularly, not combatively, but substantively, the way smart people disagree when they're trying to get to the right answer rather than trying to win. And he disagreed with her, and the disagreements were often where the best ideas came from. The company responded to the stability. Revenue in Q1 was up 14% over the previous year. The Meridian acquisition, once the board had reconstituted, moved through approval and closed in April. The Hargrove distribution expansion that had been in the framework from the first real meeting became operational in 3 new corridors. Sophie came to the office occasionally, which was now a known quantity to the 41st floor. Claire had at some point provided Sophie with a drawer in the waiting area, which contained colored pencils and a sketch pad and a small stuffed animal that Sophie had left and which Claire had not moved. Nathan chose not to examine the significance of this too closely. In the 6th week of Elena's intensive program, Nathan was in a late afternoon meeting when his phone lit up with a text from a number he didn't recognize. He looked at it anyway, which he didn't usually do in meetings. This is Dr. Akar. Elena asked me to send you something. She said you'd want to see it. Please keep it between you for now. A video followed, 9 seconds long. Elena in the rehabilitation facility, beside the parallel bars with Dr. Akar on one side. And Elena, hands on the bars, pushing, actually pushing, the effort of it visible in her shoulders and her jaw, and then rising, slowly, with enormous concentration, into a standing position. 9 seconds. She stood for maybe 4 of them before she came back down, controlled, Dr. Akar's hands ready. But she stood. Nathan looked at his phone under the conference table for a moment. Then he put it face down and finished the meeting, which took another 22 minutes, and he was present for all of it in the way that was required, asking the questions that needed asking and making the points that needed making. And then he went to his office and closed the door and watched the 9 seconds 3 more times. He texted Elena, "I saw it." She texted back, 4 seconds. 4 seconds, he typed. Dr. Akar cried a little. She'll deny it. He smiled at his phone, which was not a thing he usually did at work. "How do you feel?" A pause. Then, like something that was locked is open. He read it and read it again. "Yeah," he typed. "That's exactly what it looks like." In the last week of May, with the intensive program entering its final days, Elena asked Sophie something that Sophie reported to Nathan with the gravity of a person conveying important intelligence. They were driving home from a Saturday afternoon at Elena's building. Sophie had taken to visiting the 41st floor on occasional Saturdays when Elena worked, which she often did, and they had a working arrangement where Sophie drew at the conference table, and Elena occasionally took breaks to look at what Sophie was drawing and have opinions. And Sophie said from the back seat, "Elena asked me if I would be okay." Nathan glanced in the rearview mirror. Okay with what? She didn't say exactly. She said Sophie adopted the considering posture she used when she was being precise about someone's words. She said she wanted to make sure I was okay with the way things were changing, between her and you and us. She looked out the window. I said I didn't know what specifically was changing, but that change was mostly okay if you told me about it. He watched the road. And then she said, Sophie paused. She said that you were one of the people she trusted most in the world, and she wanted to make sure that whatever happened, she didn't mess that up. Because some things are more important than, Sophie frowned, trying to get it right, than what you want things to be. She said some things are more important than what you want. He drove for a minute without saying anything. Dad? Yeah. What did she mean? He thought about it. He thought about Elena, who had spent 2 years behind a wall that made sense and cost everything, and who was now, 8 weeks into standing up again in ways both literal and not, being careful with the things that mattered to her, being careful in the way of someone who had learned what it cost to lose things. She meant, he said carefully, that she cares about you and about what happens to you, and she doesn't want anything to change that. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Does she know that I already decided she's good? I'm not sure she does. You should tell her. Maybe you should tell her. Sophie considered this with appropriate seriousness. Okay, she said. I'll tell her Monday. He didn't say anything else about it. He drove home with the May evening light on the buildings, the city doing its spring thing, the air warm enough for the windows down, and Sophie in the back seat having apparently settled the matter to her own satisfaction and moved on to singing something low to herself that might have been from the radio or might have been entirely original. With Sophie, it was hard to tell. He let the evening in through the open windows and didn't try to settle anything just yet, because some things were better, let alone until they were ready, and he'd learned that from watching someone who was figuring out the same thing. What he knew was this. His daughter was happy. His work was good. The woman who had needed someone to actually show up had people showing up now. And outside the windows, the city was warm and possible in the particular way that late spring made everything feel, like the hard season had run its course and what came next was allowed to be better. He parked the car and sat for a moment after Sophie had already climbed out and run ahead to find out if Mrs. Adebayo's dog was in the hallway. The evening was quiet the way evenings got when you let them. He sat in the car and thought that whatever came next, he wasn't afraid of it. He turned off the engine and went inside. The sentencing happened on a Wednesday in early September, 14 months after the shareholders' meeting, and Elena did not attend. This surprised people who didn't know her and surprised nobody who did. Margaret had offered to arrange seating, had outlined the procedural details, had explained that presence at sentencing was not required but was sometimes meaningful for victims in cases like this. Elena had listened to all of it and said, "I don't need to be in that room. I know what happened. I don't need to watch them hear their consequences to believe in mine." Margaret had nodded and said that was a completely legitimate position and had attended herself, representing Elena's interests, and had called afterward with the summary. Richard Castle, 11 years, federal penitentiary, fraud and conspiracy charges, the criminal facilitation of grievous bodily harm added after Gregor Vanich's cooperation agreement had made the case against him concrete and irrefutable. Dennis Farrow, 7 years. Patricia Holm, whose role had been coordination rather than direct action, had cooperated early and received a reduced sentence of 4 years with additional civil penalties. Gregor Vanich himself, 6 years, reduced from a potential 15 in exchange for full testimony. Elena received the call in her office. Nathan was there, not by coincidence. He'd known the call was coming and had arranged to be present without making a production of it, the way he'd learned to be present for the things that mattered without announcing his presence. He watched her listen, watched her face stay controlled through the numbers. When she hung up, she set the phone precisely on the desk and looked at it for a moment. 11 years, she said. Yes. He'll be 72 when he gets out. She wasn't saying it with satisfaction. She was saying it the way you say a number when you're trying to understand what it means, measuring it against something, seeing if it fits. He sat in my board meetings for 8 years. He watched me build this company, and he decided his $8 million a year was worth more than... She stopped, put her hands flat on the desk. I keep thinking I should feel something specific right now. What do you feel? She considered it honestly, the way she did most things now. Tired, she said, and also finished, like a door closed. She looked up at him. Is that strange? No, he said. That's what finished feels like. She nodded slowly. Outside the window, Chicago was doing its early September thing, the last of the summer light, the quality of air that knew what was coming but wasn't there yet. A good kind of almost. She looked out at it, and he let her look. After a moment, she said, I want to take Sophie somewhere this weekend, somewhere she's been asking about. She paused. She mentioned the aquarium approximately 9 times in the past month. She's been running a campaign, Nathan confirmed. Then we should go to the aquarium. He looked at her. The afternoon light was on her face, and she was looking out at the city with the quality she'd developed over the past year, present in it, not managing it from a distance, not behind the wall, just in it. He thought about what Sophie had said months ago, the kind of nice that's in there even when people can't see it. It was all visible now. It had been visible for a while. He just liked noticing it. Yeah, he said, we should. The aquarium was Sophie's idea of a perfect day, which meant it was loud and involved a great deal of stopping in front of exhibits for longer than the foot traffic appreciated, and 3 separate explanations of why the beluga whale was superior to other whales that grew in detail and conviction each time. Elena listened to all 3. She asked follow-up questions. By the 3rd explanation, she was asking questions that Sophie had to actually think about, which Sophie found deeply satisfying. She had a particular expression for when an adult took her seriously enough to make her work, a brightness in her eyes that Nathan could spot from 20 feet away. They had lunch in the museum cafe, which was not the best food in Chicago by any measurement, but which Sophie declared acceptable, and sat at a table by the window with the lake outside doing its September blue. Sophie was eating with the focus she brought to meals she considered important, and said without looking up, Are you guys together? Nathan put his fork down. Elena was quiet for a half-second. What makes you ask that? Sophie looked up with the expression of someone who found the question slightly baffling. Because you're always together, and you look at each other the way people look at each other when they're together. She returned to her food. Jalen's parents look at each other like that, and Mrs. Adebayo and her husband. Nathan looked at Elena. Elena looked at Nathan. The lake was very blue outside. We're figuring things out, Nathan said. Sophie considered this. Is figuring things out the same as together? It's the early part, Elena said. Her voice was entirely steady, which Nathan found slightly remarkable. Sophie processed this. Okay, she said. I just wanted to know because I already planned for it being okay, so you don't have to figure out how to tell me. I'm telling you it's okay. She ate another bite. Also, I told Elena already that I decided she's good, so that part's done. Elena glanced at Nathan. She did tell me, she said. On a Monday, in the conference room, very directly. She's direct, Nathan said. I noticed, Elena said. I appreciate it. Sophie accepted this as appropriate and returned to her lunch with the air of someone whose administrative work here was complete. Nathan looked at his plate and felt something in his chest that was equal parts amusement and a particular kind of gratitude he didn't have precise words for. The gratitude of a person who has found, after a long time of managing without them, the exact right people in the exact right configuration. Nothing was perfect. He knew that and believed it. Sophie still had hard nights sometimes, still asked questions about her mother that Nathan didn't have satisfying answers to, still woke up occasionally from bad dreams that she didn't tell him about directly, but that he could read in the particular quiet of her the morning after. Elena still had sessions with Dr. Akar twice a week, and still had days when the physical work was discouraging and the progress felt smaller than the distance remaining. The investigation's aftermath had left loose ends. Civil proceedings still pending, the company's reputation in some corners still requiring patient reconstruction, the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being in legal and institutional processes for over a year. Real things were still in process. He wasn't naive about that, but he'd come to understand, across these 14 months, that waiting for the absence of hard things before you built something was the same as never building it. Sophie had taught him that first, at 5 years old, when she'd processed her mother leaving and decided to be okay about it. Not because it didn't hurt, but because she'd calculated, with the directness she brought to everything, that being okay was more useful than the alternative. And Elena had taught him it again, in a different register, over the long arc of this year. That the wall you build to protect yourself from being hurt is made of the same material as the thing that keeps you from living, and the only way through is the same as the only way forward, which is to decide to go. He'd been deciding to go for a long time. He thought he'd been ready before he knew he was. The Whitmore Group expansion announcement was scheduled for the third week of October, a press event in the main conference center, the biggest news the company had made in 3 years. The Meridian integration complete and the new logistics network operational across 7 corridors instead of the original 3, numbers that Nathan had helped build the strategy for, and that he now knew with the specific intimacy of someone who had watched them come together piece by piece over 8 months. Elena had asked to present it herself. Her PR team, rebuilt since the communications director turnover that had preceded Nathan's arrival, had prepared options that ranged from a seated presentation to a hybrid format that would allow her to begin from her chair and move to a podium if she chose. She had reviewed the options and said she wanted to make a decision closer to the date, which her team had accepted with the flexibility they'd learned over the past year, and which Nathan understood meant she was still figuring out what was possible and wasn't going to commit to something she wasn't certain of. What was possible had been expanding for months. Dr. Akar's 8-week intensive program had ended in late June, with Elena able to stand unassisted for up to 30 seconds and to take assisted steps along the parallel bars. This was, Dr. Akar had said carefully, significantly beyond the median expected outcome for her injury profile and the 2-year gap. She had continued twice-weekly sessions through the summer. By August, she could walk, slowly, with a cane, with the particular deliberateness of someone managing something that required full attention for short distances on flat ground. She didn't talk about it much, publicly or even privately. Claire knew. Nathan knew. Sophie knew, because Sophie noticed everything, and because Elena had told her, simply and without drama, one Saturday afternoon in the conference room. Sophie had said, "Can I see?" And Elena had stood and walked the length of the conference table and back, 8 steps out and 8 steps back. And Sophie had watched with complete seriousness and then said, "That's really good," in the tone of someone delivering a genuine professional assessment. And Elena had sat back down and they'd returned to what they'd been doing, which was Sophie showing Elena a drawing of a beluga whale that looked, Elena had said, exactly like a beluga whale and not at all like bread. The morning of the announcement, Nathan was in his office at 7:30 when Elena appeared in the doorway. She was dressed for the event. A dark suit, her hair back, the particular quality of composed readiness she'd had at the shareholders' meeting. She was standing. The cane was in her right hand, but her posture was upright and her weight was distributed in a way that Nathan had learned over months of watching Doctor. A car's updates meant she was having a good day physically, one of the days when the work of the previous months was fully available to her. "I'm going to walk out," she said. He looked at her. "To the podium." "To the podium, with the cane." She met his eyes. "I'm not going to make it a thing. It's just how I'm going to come in." "Okay," he said. "I'm not interested in it being inspiring," she said. "I'm not interested in the narrative. She paused, looking for the honest version. "I just want to walk into my own presentation. That's all it is." "That's all it is," he agreed. She looked at him for a moment. "Are you good?" "I'm very good," he said. "You?" Something crossed her face, not nerves, not exactly, but the presence of something that mattered enough to feel. "Getting there," she said. He stood up. "Then let's go." The conference center held 120 people. Press, investors, partners, senior staff, the reconstituted board. Nathan stood to the left of the room with Claire and watched the seats fill with the particular attention he'd developed for rooms that mattered, reading the energy of them, the expectation, the quality of attention that a group of people brought to an event when they understood that what happened in it was going to mean something. When Elena came through the side door and walked to the podium, the room did something that was not quite silence and not quite sound. A collective recalibration, 120 people absorbing what they were seeing and what it meant, not in the performed way of an audience at an inspirational event, but in the genuine way of people who knew this person and her history and were watching her move through space in a way they hadn't seen in 2 years. She reached the podium, set the cane against it, looked up at the room. Whitmore Group's Southeastern Distribution Network now covers 7 operational corridors, she said, and will reach 11 by the end of Q1 next year. She didn't mention the walk. She didn't mention what it had taken to get to that podium or what the past 2 years had been. She presented the expansion, the numbers, the strategy, the partnerships, the vision for the next 3 years, with the precision and authority of someone who knew exactly what she'd built and where it was going. The room listened with the quality of people who were not only receiving information, but recognizing something, the particular recognition of watching someone be fully themselves in the room where they belong. Nathan watched from the left side of the room and thought about all the presentations he'd seen in his professional life, the ones that were technically accomplished, and the ones that were memorable, and the rare ones that were both. And he thought this was one of the rare ones, and not because of the cane, or the walk, or the 2 years, or the conspiracy, or any of the story that surrounded it, but because of what Elena had said in a car a long time ago. "I forgot what it felt like to try." She had remembered. You could see it in every minute of the 40 she stood at that podium. Sophie was not there. She was in school, which was appropriate, this being a Wednesday morning in October. But she had asked that morning at breakfast what the announcement was about, and Nathan had explained in the way he'd learned to explain business things to her, and Sophie had listened and said, "Is she nervous?" "A little, maybe." "Tell her she's good," Sophie said. "She'll know what it means." He had texted Elena exactly that, at 7:15 a.m., before she'd appeared in his doorway. "Sophie says to tell you you're good." Elena had not replied until 7:28, which was when she'd appeared in his doorway, and she'd said nothing about the text, but something in her face when she'd asked, "Are you good?" had carried it. Afterward, when the room had mostly cleared and the press had what they needed and the investors had shaken hands and the partners had collected their materials, Elena found him near the windows where he'd been talking with 2 of the new board members about the Q1 projections. The board members excused themselves with the professional intuition of people who read rooms. Elena was still standing. She'd picked up the cane and she was using it, but her posture was still good, which meant she had energy left, which was not always the case after long events. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. "It went well. It went very well." She looked out the windows at the October city, gray and bright at once, the particular light of fall in Chicago that was somehow both fading and clarifying. I keep waiting to feel like it's enough, she said. The company, the numbers, all of it. She paused. I built this company because I needed to prove something. I'm not entirely sure who I was proving it to anymore. Does it matter? No, she said after a second. That's what I mean. It used to feel like the most important question, and now it doesn't. She turned from the windows. What matters now is different. He waited. Sophie's recital is next month, she said. I want to be there. He'd known about the recital. Sophie had told him Elena had been told about the recital with the specificity of someone issuing a calendar invitation. She'll want you there, he said. I know. A pause. Nathan. Yeah. She looked at him with the directness she brought to things that mattered, the same quality she'd had looking at a room of 60 people and saying the true thing. I'm not good at this part. She made a brief gesture that encompassed some territory he understood. The personal part. I spent so long making sure nothing personal was close enough to hurt that I got very efficient at keeping it away. I know, he said. I've watched you do it. And you stayed anyway. And I stayed anyway. She was quiet for a moment. The room was nearly empty around them, the conference center settling into its after-event stillness, chairs at slight angles and glasses on tables, and the particular quiet of a space that has held something significant and is now releasing it. I don't want to keep it away anymore, she said. I'm not sure I know how to stop entirely, but I don't want to. He thought about what it had taken her to say that, not the words, which were simple enough, but the choosing to say them. The choosing after 2 years of smaller and smaller life to let something fully in, rather than managing it from a careful distance. He knew how much that cost because he'd done his own version of it. The long years after Sophie's mother left where he'd poured everything into being a father and a professional, and had kept himself at the same careful remove from anything that might require him to be otherwise. They'd both been doing it. They'd recognized it in each other, probably earlier than either of them had named it. You don't have to know how, he said. You just have to not close the door. She looked at him, something in her face that was not controlled, not managed, not careful, just present. Okay, she said. I won't close the door. He nodded. Neither of them said anything else about it. They didn't need to. It was the kind of agreement that existed in what wasn't said, in the quality of two people who had figured each other out slowly and honestly, and were now standing in the same place without needing to announce it. The things that followed were not cinematic. That was the part nobody told you about when they talked about second chances, that the second chance looked a lot like regular life, which was to say, it looked like Sophie's recital in November, where she played recorder with a focus and seriousness that was completely characteristic, and Elena sat in the second row and afterward told Sophie she had been the best one, which was not objectively true, and which Sophie appreciated enormously anyway. It looked like Christmas at Nathan's apartment, which was small for 3 people and fine for 2, and exactly right for the particular 3 that showed up. Sophie decorated the tree with the aggressive thoroughness she brought to projects she cared about, and Elena helped with the high branches because Sophie couldn't reach, and Nathan was trying to make food in the kitchen and burning something, and later Sophie fell asleep on the couch before 9 o'clock, and Nathan and Elena sat in the quiet living room with the tree lights on and didn't talk much and didn't need to. It looked like Tuesday evenings occasionally, and Saturday mornings more regularly, and the specific rhythm of 3 people building a life in the incremental, unremarkable way that lives get built. Not in moments of declaration, but in the accumulation of ordinary days where the same people keep choosing to show up. Sophie, for her part, adapted to the new configuration with the practicality of someone who had decided it was good, and therefore it was. She introduced Elena to Mrs. Adebayo as, Elena, she runs a company, and also she's with my dad, which Elena received with the composure of someone who had successfully managed a federal conspiracy investigation and could handle a 7-year-old's introduction. Mrs. Adebayo had said, about time, to Nathan specifically, which Nathan chose not to analyze. Elena walked into the Whitmore Group offices every morning, with the cane on harder days and without it on the better ones. Dr. Akar said she would likely always have some days of each, that the recovery was real and the limits were also real, and the task was learning to live in the space between them without resentment. Elena had said she could do that. Nathan believed her because he'd watched her do much harder things. The company's best year in its history was the year that followed the expansion announcement. Revenue up 31%. 4 new partnerships in the first 2 quarters. The Meridian integration delivering beyond projection. The things Nathan had helped build now running under their own momentum, which was the best outcome for any strategy. Not that it required constant intervention, but that it had become part of how the place breathed. He thought sometimes, in the ordinary way that you think about things when your life has room for ordinary thinking, about what it had cost him to show up that first Tuesday at Elena's office, without knowing any of it, without knowing what he'd find or what it would become, or that the 45 minutes he'd been given would eventually become all of this. He'd said, "I'll figure it out," to Derek in the break room, the automatic statement of a man who'd learned to move forward without waiting to know what forward looked like. He hadn't been being brave, he'd just been doing the next thing. That was the thing nobody told you, he thought. The big changes didn't announce themselves. They came in through the side door while you were doing something ordinary, and by the time you understood what had happened, you were already in the middle of it, already changed, already somewhere you hadn't planned to be and couldn't imagine leaving. Sophie figured it out faster than either of the adults, which was also not something they told you. That the child you were trying to protect, the child you carried through hard years on the specific fuel of not letting her see you not know what to do. That child was sometimes the one who saw clearest what was right in front of all of you. She'd said it in a museum cafe with the lake outside. You look at each other the way people look at each other when they're together. She'd said it at 7 years old with a fork in her hand and the straightforwardness of someone who had simply been paying attention. She'd been right. She was usually right, which was going to be something Nathan would have to account for more formally as she got older and the domains of her rightness expanded. But that was a future problem, and he had learned, slowly and with effort, that the future was better approached with openness than anticipation. What he had now was this: a daughter who was 8 years old and fierce and kind and relentlessly observant, who had decided a year ago that a certain person was good and had held that position without revision. A company that was doing the best work of its history. A woman who had chosen, after 2 years of choosing smaller and smaller, to choose bigger, to walk into her own room, to stop keeping the door closed, to be in the life she'd nearly lost rather than managing it from the outside. And the ordinary Tuesdays and Saturdays and Christmases and recitals, the accumulation of days that were not dramatic and were not landmark moments, but were the actual substance of living. Those were his too now, and he valued them in the particular way you value things that you understand could have been otherwise. It was not a perfect life. Elena still had hard days with her body, still had the residue of 2 years of institutional legal proceeding, still had the particular scar tissue of a person who learned too late that the people she trusted had meant her harm. Nathan still had the specific ache of single parenthood, the awareness of the things Sophie had missed, and the things he hadn't been able to give her in the years when it was just the two of them. These were real things. They lived in the real life alongside the good parts, which was where real things lived. But Sophie drew pictures of 4 figures now. Different heights, slightly imprecise, sometimes with triangle heads, always in front of a house with a yellow sun. She didn't explain them anymore when she showed them around. The explanation had become unnecessary. Some things, when they're right, don't require explanation. They just require you to stop closing the door and let them in, one ordinary day at a time, and trust that the accumulation of showing up is enough to build something that lasts. It was. It turned out that it was.